Hi, everyone. I just wanted to share a little exciting news with you before we jump into today's episode, because I recently found out that my book called Building the Practice of Your Dreams, 1 month of daily tips for finding success, actually went to #1 on the Amazon Kindle bestseller list for law firm marketing. And I was honestly blown away. I had no idea. I had no expectation when I put it on Amazon Kindle. I really just wanted to make sure it was available to as many people as possible. So to find out that in the first month it went to #1, that anybody bought it or downloaded it, completely blows my mind. But so I was super excited. I wanted to let you know that it's available. It's only $4.99 on Kindle. You can get a copy at neonly.biz-book. So that's neon.ly/biz-book. So go ahead, get a copy. Let me know what you think of it. I've got the second one in the works already. And now let's dive into today's episode.
Coming up on today's episode of the Divorce and Beyond podcast.
Never say never, and just think about the things to think about if you end up getting remarried. How do you want to manage things while you're married? And thinking about, why did their first marriage maybe not work out? And did any of that have to do with financial issues? Being able to really get that full picture before you do. I think that people are much more hesitant to jump into just combining everything like they might in a first marriage.
Hello, and welcome to the Divorce and Beyond podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host. As a top divorce attorney and family law mediator for 30 years, I know what you need to know to get through your divorce, and most importantly, how to move beyond it to thrive and transition to your new future. My experts and I are here to give you the insider view into the process, so listen in for the wisdom and expert information you need on your journey through divorce and beyond. Hello, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and today I'm going to dive into a topic that surprisingly we've never covered before in over 300 episodes, and it's a big one. It's the ultimate beyond topic, remarrying after divorce. Now, whether you've already found new love or if you're still swearing never again, today's conversation is packed with valuable insights that could change the way you approach your next chapter. Joining me is someone I'm thrilled to introduce you all to. She's a good friend and an absolute powerhouse in the world of family mediation, Amanda Singer. Amanda is the founder of West Coast Family Mediation. She's a California licensed attorney, a CDFA, and an award-winning family mediator. With her incredible expertise in divorce and premarital mediation, she's here today to guide us through the unique challenges and opportunities that come with tying the knot again. So whether you're planning your second, third, or even fourth walk down the aisle, or if you're just curious about the topic, you are in for a treat. So let's get started. Amanda, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, I have to tell you, this topic makes me, I'm smiling as I say this because after 32, 33 years in the world of divorce, if I had $1 for every single time a client said to me, remarry, I am never getting married again. I may have even said it myself when I got divorced. And yet you and I both know people do very, very often end up remarrying after divorce, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And I hear them say the same exact thing. I'm never going to. And I usually say, well, never say never, and just think about the things to think about if you end up getting remarried.
Yeah, and that's exactly my response to them. Although, I understand it, right? When you're going through the process of divorce, which would be when people are usually talking to us, and you're going through the difficulty of that process, it may seem impossible that you might want to, walk down the aisle again. But in fact, many, many people do. But there are a lot of things that you really do need to consider when it's a second or third or fourth time down that aisle, things that are maybe a little different from the first time. And, the first things that come to my mind are that your financial situation is probably very different as you go into a second marriage. What do you see most often?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things is, depending on how your divorce went the first time, you are probably thinking about, oh gosh, I don't want to end up in a situation where I am maybe losing, as that feeling is, half of the assets that I have built up or built back up.
My assets.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep. Always mine, if it doesn't work out. So that, I think, is it's definitely something that's on the top of people's mind. Financially wise, a lot of times one or both people are going to have kids. And so you're thinking about, what are the financial implications with, depending on how old they are. Are you looking at college costs still, but also estate planning, which we can talk more about, in terms of, what do you want that to look like in terms of what goes to each of your own children versus the other person. And also just financially, the fact that it's about having a conversation before you get married. So many people don't talk about their finances before they get married. And so just having that conversation of, what do you each make? What are the assets and debts that you have? How do you want to manage things while you're married? And thinking about, why did their first marriage maybe not work out? And did any of that have to do with financial issues? And so being able to really get that full picture before you do, I think that people are much more hesitant to jump into just combining everything like they might in a first marriage.
Yeah. I think you've really hit the, nail on the head here, in that a lot of the questions that people have before marriage are pretty standard. But as you go into a second or third marriage and you have some of the, I'll call it financial residue of the first divorce that carries forward. And you've pointed out a few of them that I think are really relevant for people to think about. If you have, or your new fiance has children from a prior relationship or marriage, that has financial repercussions. They may be paying child support. You may be paying or getting child support, right? Or they may be paying. Then there's also the issues of, as you said, college, other, expenditures. You may have the inheritance issues around the children from your first marriage. And what if you have children in the second marriage, right? That's another issue that can come up, and financially how that will impact. So there are a lot of things that you might not be talking about when you get married that first time, but now suddenly become an issue in the second marriage. And what about, I know there's special complications around alimony or spousal support and considerations, right? Because if you are receiving or paying, that may have some repercussions. If your spouse or your new spouse is, it may have some repercussions. What do you tell people about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm in California, as you said. So I just like to make that clear, because some states could be a little bit different. But in California, if you get remarried and you're receiving spousal support, then it is going to end unless you agree differently, right? That's very rare, although I did have a case where that had happened. So, if you are receiving spousal support and getting remarried, you need to know that that's going to go away. And so that's a financial consideration to think about. However, if you are paying spousal support to an ex-spouse and you get remarried, I hate to say it, but you have to keep paying. Nothing happens. Yeah. I get that question too all the time. Most states, it's the same, that alimony or spousal support is going to end, but there could be some exceptions. And also, I think the thing to be aware of is that in some states, it's just automatic, right? That other person gets married, it ends, nothing else to do. In some states, you might have to actually request a termination. And so it's just being aware of, what is that situation in your state.
Yeah. And just being aware that this very well could have a significant change on your finances when you remarry. So, and, one of the things that people often don't realize that they can talk about, as you mentioned in a prenup, is that issue of spousal support or alimony. So if whether or not that was an issue in your first divorce, you can talk about that and make some preliminary agreements about what might happen if this second relationship, second marriage doesn't work out. And in fact, that's a pretty common topic in a premarital agreement for whether it's your first premarital agreement or your second or your third, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that when it's a second or third, what I see is there is much more emotional baggage coming along with that conversation, because I have had that come up where it's, I had to pay my ex-spouse more than I thought I should have, or, whatever that situation looked like. And they really don't want to end up in that situation again. And so I find that it is a little bit different of a conversation than you're having when it is a first marriage, but it is still important. And, when you're having that conversation, it isn't just about, okay, is somebody going to waive spousal support? I think it's more about, well, let's have a conversation. Is there anything you want to put in place now while you are both happy and love each other and agree on things that might make that conversation easier? Because for all the years you practice, spousal support is one of those most difficult conversations. Nobody wants to pay it. I'm sorry, it doesn't matter who you are, nobody wants to. And so if you can put some stuff in place ahead of time that you feel is reasonable, it can make that conversation down the road easier.
Yeah, I think it's a really important realization for people, as you're saying, to know that when it's your second marriage, or perhaps your new fiance's second marriage, some of that baggage that comes into these discussions that you're having is nuanced, is impacted by some of the emotional and financial impact of that first divorce, right? Like you just said, I've always said to clients, because another thing I wish I had $1 for was the person who came into my office saying, I don't want to pay alimony. So that's my number one priority, is whatever you do, I don't want to pay alimony. And I was like, well, gosh, I don't know that I've ever had someone walk into my office, and this is back in the old days, and pull out that checkbook with their pen and say, when do I get to write that first alimony check, right? Nobody wants to pay that alimony, as you said. But it's one thing when you've never dealt with alimony to have thoughts about alimony and discussions premaritally about alimony. It is a whole different conversation when alimony has been a part of your life in some way. And that's what you're facing, that conversation that's very different, whether you've been paying it or receiving it. And now you're going into a new conversation about what alimony might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, I think, a little bit more difficult, and you may still have somebody still paying alimony, right? Like you could be in that situation where you're getting remarried and you're still paying an ex-spouse. And so, having that conversation is just so important.
Well, and that goes to what you just said, right? Like the importance, and I think this is the importance of a prenup all the way around, whether it's your first one or your 10th one. I think it is important that you have those financial discussions, but it's a really good point to understand that the remarriage does not wipe out all of the financial repercussions of that prior divorce and the trickle down of that, which could be, as you pointed out, some financial obligations that extend out way into the future, like college education. If your fiance has, children who are in elementary school, it's likely that your fiance might have some legal obligations under their prior divorce decree, if they're the ones who were married before, that will extend out for a couple of decades, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even if children are older and they're, you maybe don't have legal obligations anymore outside of college or something, you have to think about, what does each person want to cover for their children, right? I think sometimes that conversation doesn't always come up, and one person is like, well, I plan on putting them all the way through graduate school, or, I want to give money for them to buy a home, or you may have different perspectives on how you're going to support your children moving forward financially. And if you haven't discussed that, that might be a big surprise when all of a sudden you're wanting to give money to, your child, and maybe from a first marriage, and your spouse at that point now isn't.
Yeah. I mean, it really can get a little complicated. Finances can be an emotional topic as it is, but when you layer in children from other relationships and then perhaps children of this relationship in the new marriage, these conversations and these decisions about our money, your money, their money takes on a whole new perspective. And you made a good point earlier that I want to emphasize for people is that one of the benefits of having a prenuptial agreement and discussing these things ahead of time is, one, you may not even think to discuss these things. And then suddenly they're an issue and it's a heated moment, or it's of the moment. And have these discussions with some assistance and at a time when you love each other and you're looking forward to a lifetime together, and you can talk about these things hopefully in a reasonable way without the emotion of the moment. Certainly these discussions can be emotional. Hey everyone, it's Susan. So look, we know going through a divorce is tough and self-care can easily get overlooked. I wanted to share something that helped me, and that was creating a cozy space to relax. Something that can help you is Parachute Home, which is bedding and home goods that bring real comfort. Imagine ending your day wrapped in the softest sheets or a warm blanket. So if you're looking to add a bit of peace to your home, visit divorcebeyond.com/parachute. When you shop through my link, it supports the podcast, and you know how much I appreciate that. So remember, taking care of yourself is a big step forward. So check out Parachute Home and get yourself your own warm, cozy hug. Before we take a quick break, I want to make sure you don't miss what's coming in part 2 of today's episode. Amanda and I will be diving even deeper into the unique challenges of blending families and the must-have conversations to ensure your remarriage starts on solid ground. Plus, Amanda will share her expert insights on using premarital mediation to tackle those tough financial and family dynamics before they become roadblocks, and how it can actually bring you closer as a couple. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with even more tips to help you to create the happy, healthy, and harmonious marriage you deserve.
The couple come in together, we have a conversation, and we can discuss all of the things that they may want in an agreement, talk about what do they have from prior to marriage, how do they want to handle things during, and really get a handle on, okay, what are the agreements that they each want going into their premarital agreement.
Before we jump back into the episode, I want to remind you that the Divorce and Beyond podcast has an incredible archive of over 300 episodes covering just about every topic you can imagine when it comes to divorce, healing, and moving forward. So if today's episode resonates with you, I highly recommend checking out last week's conversation with Dawn Wiggins, LMFT. Dawn is an integrative healer who combines traditional therapy with cutting-edge approaches to address mind, body, and spirit. It's an episode packed with insights and tools that can help you create lasting, holistic healing in your life. And if you're looking for even more, our archives are full of episodes that can help you tackle whatever challenges you're facing, whether it's co-parenting, finances, or finding your new path after divorce. So don't miss the Dawn Wiggins episode, and be sure to explore our archives whenever you listen to podcasts. Now let's get back to today's conversation. Your firm does a lot of premarital mediation or premarital agreement mediation. And I'm just wondering if you could layer in here what that is, because I don't think a lot of my listeners even understand that prenuptial agreements are something that are mediated all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the topics I love to talk about, because I think that it really is a great use of mediation. And like you said, I think more people know about divorce mediation, of course, now, but they're not thinking about it for like a premarital agreement. And so what's nice in the way that that works is that just like when you're in mediation for a divorce, but you've got a neutral third party, I have the opportunity to sit down with both of the future spouses, something where if each of them are represented by their own attorney, most of the time it's not negotiating all together. It ends up with the attorneys arguing. So what it allows me to do is have the couple come in together. We have a conversation and we can discuss all of the things that they may want in an agreement, talk about, what do they have from prior to marriage? How do they want to handle things during? Talk about if there are kids from prior relationship, and really get a handle on, okay, what are the agreements that they each want going into their premarital agreement? And what's great about that is that we get to have that conversation and work together on it, such that then when they take it to their own attorneys, because California is this way and most states are, they still each need to have their own attorney to represent them. But when they take it to those individual attorneys, most of the time it's just a check the box and they're getting it signed off on. There's very little arguing back and forth because we've had those conversations together. And so it also provides buy-in, especially if there's one spouse that's maybe hesitant about a prenup. That happens often, is that it's being driven by one of them, not by both. And so by doing it through mediation, we're able to sit down and have a conversation jointly where I can really bring that person into the conversation more than if they just got handed a prenup by their fiance and they're not sure what to do with it.
Which we've unfortunately seen more than we would like to see. I still have that one client who we had prepared the prenup well in advance, but he gave it to his fiance at the back of the church before they were about to walk down the aisle. I was like, that's good timing on something like that. And I think it's really important what you're saying for people, because I want them to understand. You were talking about the emotional aspect of one party sort of driving a prenuptial agreement. And I think that's really common. It's usually one or the other of the parties who really thinks that's important and is sort of pushing that to be something that is something that is done between these two people ahead of time, but it's not usually a nuanced and thoughtful conversation between the two parties. And that's what the premarital mediation allows this to be, so that both of them have the chance to be heard on what their priorities are. Because one of the things I've seen, and maybe you have as well, is people presume they know what their spouse or their new upcoming spouse would think about a topic. Well, if this were to happen, of course they'd agree that I could give money to my children, or I could take my 40-year-old child could come live with us if they, wanted to, or something like that. And they've never really talked about it. So the other thing I think a mediator brings to the table, especially one with the experience that you have, is an ability to sort of what ifs, bring these topics, much as we're doing in this episode, right? Raising things that I suspect my listeners are like, oh man, I never thought about that. Like, wow, I guess that alimony that I'm receiving or paying, or that they're receiving or paying, that will have an impact on our future life together in our marriage. I think there's a whole list of things that people probably can't even think of that the mediator will know to bring up, especially one like you with a CDFA as well in your pocket.
Yeah, certainly. And I think the thing too is, we're talking a lot about the financial considerations, which is of course really important. But I think it's also important, when there are kids involved, there's just so much that may be non-financial to talk about too, right? Like, how are you going to parent? What is that parenting styles and discipline? What is that going to look like? Responsibilities. And so I think that when you go to attorneys for a prenup, they don't care about any of that, right? They're not thinking about it. They're just thinking from a purely financial perspective. What happens if you get divorced, and how do we protect your assets? And so I think it's important to have the full conversation, because the finances are really important, but they're also going to be related to other things.
It's such a good point. And I can tell you, right, I am a stepmother. So I stepped into my second marriage. And although I did not have children, my husband had 5-year-old triplets at the time. And I remember, I'm a divorce attorney, for God's sakes. I certainly knew the issues that we were facing, but I will be very honest, until you are a step parent, you have no idea And because I wasn't a parent, I didn't have an idea of all of the issues that would come up as you're talking about here, right? In this co-parenting, in this new world, right? And I really wish we'd had that opportunity maybe to have some of these conversations from someone who was able to just sort of raise some what ifs, or what might this look like, or have the two of you talked about, or any of those things. Because as you point out, they're not really legal issues, right? You know, they're my stepchildren. They're not my children. I don't have a say as a parent in their lives, but these were little humans who were in my house all the time, right? Good conversations to have. So what types of conversations do you encourage when you have a couple say that either are blending families or one of them has children?
Yeah. So it's certainly going to matter how old the children are, right? I mean, 5-year-old triplets is a very different conversation than coming into a marriage with, adult children. So I think that's,
Sure.
Big things to consider. But really, if they're minors, right, if they're going to be under 18, custody is still an issue. It's understanding, like, what does that look like? And if you both have children, are you on similar schedules? Are you not? Like, really just how is this going to impact the household? I think it's also emotional considerations for the children at all ages, right? When they're younger, they're going to be living in a new household with potentially stepbrothers and sisters, but definitely a step parent. What does that look like? But even when they're older, I think that sometimes people think that it doesn't matter as much if you're getting remarried and your kids are out of the house, but there's still a lot of considerations. Do they feel like this new person is replacing them in some ways? When, I mentioned before about estate planning, I think what comes up a lot is, okay, mom or dad is getting remarried. Does this mean that their new spouse is going to inherit what they have, or are they still carving out certain things that go to the children? And so, there's just a lot to talk about. And, depending on the age of your children, if they're older, having that conversation with them as well can be really helpful.
See, that's a nice thought there, right? That if you have age-appropriate children who are in this mix, premarital mediation can include input from all family members. It's not like a negotiated between two attorneys. I mean, I practiced as that type of attorney for a long time, and I can tell you, prenups for the most part we'd send a letter that had a proposal in it. They'd send a letter that had a counter proposal, and we'd go back and forth. And then we'd start putting it into the full agreement that would then go back and forth in red line version. But rarely did we ever have a sit down with everybody sitting at a table together. Whereas the process that you're describing, the people who are involved actually having the discussions, and this becomes a part of the vehicle for having it. The mediation is the holding place for having what, I think people can tell from what we're talking about. Some of these can be difficult conversations. It's not all, everyone always thinks mediation is the kumbaya form of divorce. It's also not the kumbaya form of premarital negotiation, but it's a much more sane and humane way for you to be able to enter into your new marriage, the one that you thought maybe you were never going to have, but now you are, right? With some clear expectations for this new relationship and some real outlines. Because you just mentioned another thing that I think is important that many people don't realize the prenup can cover, and that is the estate planning. People think of prenups as being about divorce. And they forget or don't know that prenups can also have a real impact on what's going to happen if you are still married to your spouse when one of you dies. And as you said earlier, right, there can be complications right there, because now you may have your children from the prior relationship, perhaps their children from a prior relationship, and maybe you have children of this relationship. And so the inheritance situation, the estate situation can get complicated, but you do talk about that in the premarital mediation as well, right?
I always say, like you're talking about, that a prenup is for divorce and death, right? And so let's talk about what, all of that looks like. And some of it will go into the prenup, and then they, of course, still have to do their estate planning. So I always talk about the importance of then going to an estate planning attorney to make sure you've got your will and your trust, all of that stuff squared away, because your prenup isn't going to hold up in probate court necessarily, right? You need to still have the other things. Right. But let's discuss it. And what I find too is that it then makes it easier on a lot of the estate planning attorneys as well, because we've already had those conversations and they just need the legal documents drafted correctly. And so it helps to discuss it and figure out, what is that scenario going to look like? It's interesting. A few years ago, I had done premarital agreements for two sisters, and they referred their mom, who was getting married, because there were some concerns around, they were adults, right? So what did that look like inheritance wise? And, it was an interesting conversation because they both had older children, and we talked about what may go to the other person versus what's going to get left to the children. And then, like I said before, I encouraged them to then have that conversation and make sure that the kids all knew, right? It needed to be clear now, not when you die.
Well, such an important factor, right? That is a gift to that entire family, because if you've made plans that haven't been shared and someone's going to be unhappy about those, you're leaving your spouse, because remember, this is not the situation where your second marriage has ended in divorce. This is the situation where your second marriage or subsequent marriage has ended because one of you passed away, and you leave your spouse at that time perhaps in a difficult position with your children. That wasn't necessary, but that's actually the most common situation when people don't do this pre-planning. And you're right, it is important for people. I just want to reiterate for my listeners, it's very important to understand that it's sort of a two-step process, that you do the premarital planning and then you effectuate what you agreed about estate planning by then having prepared the correct estate planning documents that may get updated over time. Mm-hmm. Things don't stay static, but really important. So one thing I'm just wondering as we're sitting here, just so that people understand, how far in advance of going down the aisle for the second, third, or fourth time should somebody reach out to a mediator and get this process started? What's a best practice?
Yeah, so that may vary a little bit by state, because California has some timeline things of the client you mentioned before that gave the prenup to his fiance in the church. That's going to have issues probably in most states, but definitely in California. So, I like to say, if you're saying best practices, I would say at least 6 months. I've had people who come to me up to almost a year, and it's wonderful when they come that early. I also have people who call and it's, we're getting married in a month, or we're getting married in 2 months. And it's not impossible, especially I think with mediation, because if they're both on the same page and willing to do that, but it's going to be much more difficult, and you may run into some enforceability issues down the road. So the more time that you can allow for it, the better, especially if you're going to have some of these difficult conversations and want to take the time needed to really figure out, okay, what are going to be the best agreements for us and for our families?
I always told people it may seem odd, but when you get engaged, it's a really good time to start talking about this, because once you get the planning done and your prenup is ready to go, then you actually get to just sit down and focus on all the fabulous aspects of the party that's coming up and the wonderful day that you're going to have with your friends and your family. People who introduce this topic really close to the wedding, putting aside the legal issues, which are enforceability, you're also bringing an aspect into it that can make your life more difficult for both of you when you really want to be focusing with each other and with your families on a positive thing. Yeah. So if someone reached out to you and was listening right now and was thinking, well, great, we are getting remarried, or I'm getting remarried, how do I even start this mediation process? What do you tell people?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is we talk about, have you talked about it with your fiance, right? Like, have you, because sometimes it's still just one person gathering that information or one person driving, as we said, most of the time, the process. And so, I will say, have you guys talked about that already? And sometimes we talk about how to do that. I've got some great blogs and resources on our website as well of like, what do I do if my fiance doesn't want a prenup, or how do I approach that conversation? Because I think that there is still, we haven't really talked about this, but there is still some stigma around having a prenup. And so sometimes the other person is going to be like, nope, like, you don't trust me. I would like, why are you asking for that? And so it's how you present that conversation that I think is really important. And then from there, it's, yes, let's make sure we're doing this far enough in advance. You've got to gather together financial information, right? And then we're going to, meet to have those discussions.
Yeah, I think that, and tell everyone the website just so we can make sure we'll have all the information in the show notes, everyone. But you just mentioned you had some great resources there. I want people to know.
Yes. So the website is westcoastfamilymediation.com.
Okay. So we'll have a link to that. And there are a lot of great resources. If I can suggest, if you are out there listening to this right now and you're thinking, hey, maybe a prenup is a great idea, but you haven't talked about it with your spouse or your soon-to-be spouse, send them a copy, send them a link to this episode, because you've just heard Amanda, who's an expert in the topic, kind of highlight at a high level some of the things that maybe the two of you have not thought about or haven't talked about. And sometimes a podcast episode's a great way to sort of open that door and get people thinking like, this is for both of our benefit and, really importantly, our children, our families, and the relationship. Because as you pointed out, having these conversations ahead of time actually helps the relationship as you go into it, because you've talked about things that you might not have talked about before. Since you have decided, and if you are one of the people who's going into a second or later subsequent marriage, you have gotten over that I'm never getting married again hurdle. Let's get you off on the best footing possible. So again, Amanda, you guys specialize in California prenuptial agreements and premarital mediation and mediation. Of course, you handle all kinds of mediation in family matters. One of the specialties is very much this prenuptial and premarital mediation. What is the best way to reach out to you if someone's listening right now and would like to ask you more questions or talk to you about your services?
Yeah, so the website is a great place. Like I said, westcoastfamilymediation.com. We've got contact information there, a contact form, make it really easy to get in touch.
All right. And I will put links to Amanda. We'll have more information about Amanda and West Coast Family Mediation in the show notes, as always, listeners. So go there. Definitely go and just see some of the blogs and resources that they have there if this is the topic that is facing you and your fiance at the moment. And get that second, third, fourth, fifth marriage off on the right step. So Amanda, thank you so much for coming and talking about this with my listeners. I love to think of people finding love again. And as this episode airs, right, we're going into the new year. And we know that not only, unfortunately, is January the month with the highest number of divorce filings, but it's also, everyone, peak dating season. So some of you are going out there in the world and finding new love. And this is one of the ways that you can maybe divorce-proof that new relationship and that new marriage. So thank you so much for helping.
Thank you so much for having me. Love talking about this topic.
Thank you for joining me today on the Divorce and Beyond podcast. I hope you found some information and inspiration to help you on this journey. Please join me every Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a new episode. And if you like the show, please take the time to subscribe and leave me a 5-star review on iTunes. You can also find more information on the website at divorceandbeyondpod.com, where you'll find links to the YouTube channel, transcripts of the episodes, and other bonus content. So I'll see you next week to help you move through your divorce and beyond.